Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Blavatnik School. An absolute pleasure to have you all here. My name is Karthik Ramana, and I'm a professor here at the school. And over the course of the year, as a faculty member here, I've gotten to know Lucy and her team, in part for the fabulous work that they've been doing. They've also engaged very thoughtfully with a very distinguished group of senior fellows that we have here at the school. And Lucy has become an integral part of that. And so hence I was absolutely delighted when I was asked if I could come here and introduce this event because we've benefited tremendously from Lucy and from the Heywood program. Many of you are new here to the school, or this might be you're returning to the school. So I just want to say a word or two about the Blavatnik School and about our mission and what it is we are doing, and a word about the Heywood Fellowship, of course, and before I turn it over to Suzanne for further remarks about the Heywood Fellowship. So the Blavatnik School of Government was created about 15 years ago, and we have a mission to deliver on a world better governed, better served, and eventually better led. And one of the things we do, one of the flagship activities here at the Blavatnik School is the Master of Public Policy program, or MPP program. And my colleague, Professor Tom Hale, over there is the director of the MPP program. And every year we bring together about 150 students from 70 different countries. And they have, very different backgrounds. They care and they're passionate about very different things. But there's one thing that unites them, and that is the spirit of public service. And they want to be able to use their time here to understand how to be more effective in government. So we say that this is a school that obviously, as you would expect from a graduate research institution at Oxford University, that equips them in a certain analytical intelligence and analytical heft. It also equips them to have genuine conversations about ethics and values across different cultures and civilizations. But above all, it equips them to get things done. We think that the art of management, of public management, is at the heart of effective government. And one of the things that is a focus of the school is building effective public managers. So it's in that context that the Heywood Fellowship has been such a delightful addition to the school. It has been the basis on which, thanks to the Heywood Foundation, we've been able to bring some very distinguished public leaders civil servants to the school. Lucy is the third of 3 Heywood Fellows. We have our 4th Heywood Fellow currently in place already now, and we have benefited from each of them. They have obviously had very distinguished careers before they got here. They've had a very distinguished impact on the school and on the MPP students in particular, where they've served as mentors to the MPP students. They've served as inspirations to the MPP students. And of course, our Heywood Fellows, as they leave, have gone on to do wonderful things in government here in the UK. And of course, we expect no less from our Heywood Fellows going forward as well. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce Suzanne Heywood to say a word about the Heywood Foundation and the Heywood Fellowships. Suzanne is a distinguished business leader, but with a career and a background in civil service. Amongst her various business responsibilities, most interesting to me is that she has responsibility over Ferrari. And so that makes it particularly exciting. And Louboutin shoes. So if you get a moment to talk to Suzanne about that, she will show you the soles of her shoes, which have that splendid red, which we all love so much. So I'll turn it over to Suzanne in a moment. But before that, I do want to take a moment to first thank Lucy's splendid team that have been part of the Heywood Fellowship this year. They have played, just as Lucy has, a tremendous role in sort of the mentorship and the sort of education of the MPPs that I spoke to earlier. And so we have Marius, Philip, Alex, Zainab, and Benjamin online. So in the 4 of you, please stand up. Benjamin, of course, if you do, we can't see you. But a round of applause to them, please. Thank you so much. One other point of housekeeping is, so after Suzanne introduces Lucy, Lucy's going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes before there are Q&A with my colleague, Professor Kieran Martin, who will facilitate that. And then I'll come back at the very end and close the session. But during Lucy's part of the remarks, the uninterrupted 40 minutes, she will have, it won't be entirely uninterrupted because she will have an interactive component to it, where she will be polling you for questions associated with this, her project on the National Strategy Playbook. And you will be asked to sort of respond to those, but as this session is being recorded, we want to assure you that the camera will pan in on Lucy at that time. So how you vote will not be captured because these will be some fairly, so you say, colorful questions. And so how you vote will not be captured on the camera. You can be, but if during the Q&A session that Kieran curates, you ask a question, the camera will pan on you. And so your questions will in fact be public as part of the video recording. Right, so that's a little distinction that we wanted to make clear. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Suzanne. Suzanne, please, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, don't take too long because we're all here to listen to Lucy. But I did want to say a few words before we start about what the Heywood Foundation is and what the fellowships are, and a little bit kind of what we do. I think today's lecture is going to be a great illustration of that. The Heywood Fellowships were set up in memory of my late husband, Jeremy Heywood, who was Cabinet Secretary and head of the Civil Service. And the thing that Jeremy was really, really passionate about was innovation in public policy. And that was the one thing that really defined him as a civil servant and then particularly as a cabinet secretary. So when he passed away, we set up the foundation to try and preserve that. And the main way in which we do that is through the Heywood Fellows. And the idea is that the Heywood Fellows, very well described before as kind of senior civil servants with real kind of potential both now and in the future, that they would take an area of public policy and they would get to explore it in a way that's just very, very hard to do when you're doing the day job within the civil service. So they'll get the kind of time to do that, and they would get to do it in a setting where they could interact with academics, where they could go and visit other countries and see what they could find, and indeed really kind of connect with people outside the civil service, which again is something which is very hard to do when you're sitting inside the day job. I think Lucy's project is a very good example of all of that. I do want to thank the Blavatnik School, which has been the host for all of the Heywood Fellowships. So we've had 3 so far. We have a 4th one coming up, which is great. Also, Hertford College, Jeremy's old college, which has agreed to basically host all of the fellows, which is great. And the ESRC, who've funded a research associate to go alongside each of the fellowships. And we have our ESRC fellow here today as well. So Lucy's lecture today, before I go on, the other thing that the Heywood Foundation does, I have to make a quick plug, also in the theme of promoting policy innovation, is we publish a quarterly journal called the Heywood Quarterly. And I have the latest version, which has just come out yesterday. But actually, it's mainly read online. It's completely free to read. The idea is we were trying to bring back something that, again, Jeremy created, which is called the Civil Service Quarterly. And it's supposed to be a publication which enables people to share best practice across the public sector in the UK. So not just the civil service, but also the foreign service. So we have an article in here by our first blind ambassador and her ambassador, which is very good, plays a key role. But also local government and people sitting outside of the public sector, but who have a very interesting view of it. It's free to read. Just kind of go to heywoodquarterly.com and you can kind of read it. Please do take a look at it. Great. So Lucy's lecture today is entitled, and I have written it down so I get it right, Challenges, Choices and Reimagined Big Bets, Designing a Contemporary Practice of National Strategy Making. Lucy comes to this with a huge amount of experience. She was Strategy Director at the Department of Education. She was Principal Private Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister during the coalition. So that was a very easy job. And then she decided that wasn't enough, so she went on to become Director General leading on the Constitution and devolution during Brexit. So clearly somebody who does not shirk a challenge. And most recently, she was Director General for Strategy in DEFRA. I'm really excited about the topic that she's been working on because we really need the government to be able to think about long-term challenges, and we know it's not easy. It is, I mean, some of the biggest challenges that we face, and we'll talk about some of them today, are really cross-generational. And we've never, as a country, managed to find a way to design policies which are cross-generational. And it's very easy for us to make excuses for that. The most common one being we have a parliamentary democracy, so how can we do things across kind of parliamentary terms? Lucy's taken an opposite approach. Rather than trying to think about why we can't do it, she's gone out trying to think about how we can do it. And that's kind of led us to where we are today. I'm really excited to kind of hear how this is going to work. Really, really excited to see whether this playbook is really going to make a difference in government. So Lucy, welcome, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for those very generous introductions. I should say as well, it is an honour to be giving this lecture at the end of my Heywood Fellowship, and I just want to start with a few thanks to the Heywood Foundation, to the Blavatnik School of Government, to Hertford College, to the Economic and Social Research Council, and to the Civil Service for supporting the fellowship and the kind of experience that it allows us to have as policymakers. And with the other 3 Heywood Fellows, it's also wonderful to be building this body of work focused on solving the big problems of government policy and practice, and also in the spirit of Jeremy Heywood, in whose name the fellowship is established. And I also wanted to say thank you all very much for coming to this lecture. I do feel that I'm sort of standing here in front of a very grand sounding title, but my journey to this topic hasn't really been through the sort of grandness of my roles. Mainly it's been driven by 2 things. So firstly, from a curiosity about how things work. So I did early jobs in how we make laws and how we spend money in the UK government. Then I went on to looking at how we make coalition function as a form of government, how our unwritten constitution actually works, and then at DEFRA to this question of how to commit to and deliver really long-term goals. And then second, an ongoing interest in how we make choices. Education policy is an absolutely brilliant area in which to learn about strategic choice making. It gets you straight to the profound trade-offs in society between generations. Do you put your money into the early years or do you put it into skills? And this weighing of outcomes for all versus fairness for some individuals and groups. How much should you focus on raising the bar for everyone versus reducing gaps? At its irreducible core, the most critical thing government and politics needs to be good at is making choices. How we set ourselves up to do that, the structures, the practices, the incentives and the relationships we create, is critical to the nature of the choices we end up making. I've talked about this question of long-term strategy making with many different audiences this year, but this is the first time I've spoken to an audience with such a diverse range of backgrounds all in the same room. We've got Blavatnik students, civil servants, academics, people watching online from our international visits. We've got guests from nearby in Oxford. Perhaps most dauntingly, my parents are here. One of the challenges for this project has been how to construct a language and a way of talking about long-term strategy that can make sense to people from very different backgrounds, very different starting points and perspectives. If we're going to have national strategy of any sort, it has to make sense to everyone. So one of the things we'd love to hear from you at the end is what made sense, what rang true to you, and what did you not like? And the Heywood team have already been made to stand up, so I won't make them do it again. But they're sort of ready to hear from you at the end with any kind of thoughts that you have about it. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the 4 big things we need to do long-term strategy better in the UK. Firstly, we have to have long-term horizons that go beyond electoral cycles. Secondly, we've intentionally called this national strategy and not government strategy. And that's because working for the long term requires a new kind of relationship between government and other actors in society. Thirdly, we have to make big bets on how to navigate the future. We have to bring in big ideas from across society, contest them, make choices between them, and pivot to them. And then finally, we've got to do all of this with a completely new level of openness and transparency. And I wanted to hold this up. This is the playbook that sets out how this should be done. We've written down the whole process, stage by stage, and now, hopefully, it's in your hands. I also want to acknowledge all those who contributed so generously to this project from the countries we studied and visited, many of whom are watching online. As a UK civil servant, this has been a unique opportunity to study countries outside the UK, and we've benefited hugely from the conversations we had in Spain, Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands and Ireland. I'm going to talk about what we learned, and I'm going to use their examples to talk about why the 4 things I've just mentioned are not only vital, but they're also practically possible. But before we dive into this question of how we do long-term strategy in the UK and what it means in practice, I thought it would be fair to spend a little bit of time exploring the what. What might we be talking about when we talk about long-term strategy? And this is where you all come in. In the playbook, we posit that we should take a 15-year view of our biggest challenges. So that puts us in 2040 if we were thinking about this today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you 6 questions about the UK in 2040, and I want you all to vote. I know that not everyone in the room is from the UK, but you do all have equal voting rights today. Also, a hand in the air means yes to the question. No hand in the air means no. There's no don't know option. So in the spirit of learning from other countries, in this case, Australia or Belgium, this is a variety of compulsory voting. You will be voting. So to kick off, in 2040, will the UK's relationships with the US, Europe and China look broadly the same as now? I'd say that's about 21%. Will the United Kingdom, as currently made up of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, exist in its current form? That looks much more like 89%. Will the UK be on track for net zero? That looks like 4%. Will UK citizens be paying a personal financial contribution for their treatment on the NHS? I mean, that looks like a majority. Will the public broadly trust scientists? That's not quite everybody, but near. And will AI create more jobs than it replaces? That's about 10%. Of course, look, we don't know the answer to these questions, and I was trying to demonstrate by the room that there is significant uncertainty about them. Each could represent a profoundly different future compared to today. As you answered the questions, you might have been wrangling with yourself over what you thought would happen, like what's your best prediction, and what you wanted to imagine the future would be like. And the primary question for strategy making isn't about our predictive powers, it's what we want to have agency over. In the time we've been working on this fellowship, we've had a general election and a change of government, a new US president with a radically different approach to the norms of global trade and security, ongoing wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, a series of budgets and spending reviews as the government grapples with economic growth under high and expensive public debt, and a sharpening of the mood over illegal immigration. The government has published major strategies, the National Security Strategy, the NHS 10-year plan, and the Industrial Strategy among them. I want to acknowledge this because for those in the audience who work in government and politics, this isn't a context in which a lot of obvious stepping back and redesigning can go on. We have to respond, and we have to respond quickly. We have to make good judgments, good decisions in flight, and we have to arrive at them using the structures, the practices, the relationships, and the behaviours that we've learned. And these are things we've all learned as policymakers by solving previous problems, individually and collectively, and they're things we've learned over time from our institutional environment. It's true of those working in government, civil servants, and it's true of those holding elected office in parliament or in ministerial positions. And it's true of all those other partners in any national effort, devolved and local government, business, public services, all those whose relationships to policymaking have been defined and embedded by these practices over time. But what if these practices are no longer serving us? What if they aren't appropriate for the problems of today? What if short-term horizons mean we're incapable of imagining the futures we need to prepare for? What if our current attitude to complexity and risk means we're too wedded to the status quo and not considering the big ideas? What if our habitual ways of doing things mean we're not confronting choices honestly, or allowing ourselves to interrogate whether the really big policy assumptions embedded in our thinking are going to serve us well in the next phase? And what if we're not confident enough to think that if we make a bold pivot, the system will back it up? Our response to this problem set has been to redesign how we do long-term national strategy in the UK. We wanted to think about what new practices we would need to enable us as a country to adopt a long-term outlook, diagnosed our biggest challenges, set longer-term goals, and reimagine our big bets. From early on in this project, we saw that reactions to the idea of designing a way of doing long-term strategy basically fell into three different camps. So firstly, there were the supporters, the people who think this is a great idea. These people share a diagnosis that our ability to think long-term and make strategy just doesn't stand up to the realities of today. Many of the people in this camp are already doing work on this themselves, but they're not homogenous in their views. For example, some come from a grand strategy perspective, some from the idea we're in a poly crisis, some from a sense of urgency to tackle intergenerational fairness. And these are profoundly different schools of thought, actually. Then secondly, there are the skeptics. So these are the people who just don't think it's a good idea. And these were people who thought it was either impossible or undesirable, in fact, to do long-term strategy. Again, they share this as their overall view, but from a lot of different perspectives. For example, because voting in elections should do it for us, or they think it's only possible in small countries facing existential threats, or great powers with the levers of history in their hands. Because basically of something unique about the UK, our size, history, open economy and adversarial politics, which means we can't do it. And then thirdly, there were the people who said, It would be great. We need it, but we'll never be able to do it. These people were with us in spirit, but sceptical that we'd ever be able to design it, mobilise behind it, and deliver this kind of change. We'll call them the practical sceptics. So this set of views presented to us a threefold provocation for how we were going to have to think in this project. So for the supporters, we needed the language, the concepts, the ideas that can build a coalition of people who come from very different disciplines and perspectives. We need people who are deeply immersed in geopolitics, defence and military strategy to develop a common way of thinking with those who care about intergenerational fairness or prevention in public services. We would need them to agree on a set of actions and methods where nobody's specific mental map or framework for understanding the world was going to triumph over anybody else's. And then for the skeptics, we knew we'd need to engage with the very hardest questions and the deepest sorts of critiques of this approach. So we needed to study countries around the world that are democratic and sufficiently large, but not too large, and to build our evidence base for why others can and are thinking in this way. We needed to examine our history and whether we could draw on any examples from our own approaches, our own successes and failures in the past. And we needed to face into the most difficult questions of design. How do you fit long-term thinking with adversarial democratic politics? How do you value the renewing mechanisms of democracy, the competition of ideas that it enables in the way that you design strategic practice? And how do we embrace the realities of the way the UK is set up and governed, devolution in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and the growing assertiveness of mayors and places as a strength that helps us deliver collectively important outcomes? And then finally, for the practical skeptics, we basically needed a solution, a comprehensive one for how we could reintroduce long-term strategic thinking as a core practice in the UK state machinery. And it's the practical skeptics who inspired the product we're launching today, the National Strategy Playbook. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the playbook to explain what it is. Basically, it's an account in 6 sections, setting out 25 instructions which, if followed in order, will result in a long-term national strategy in the UK. Section 1 sets out the new institutions we need to make it work. We posit an interparliamentary committee to engage with and oversee this process, and a new National Office of Foresight and Strategy to run it. Section 2 of our playbook is about diagnosis. We posit a 15-year outlook on the key challenges facing the UK and the development and publication of national scenarios to foster a public debate about the future. Section 3 is about the different pathways the UK could choose. At this point in the playbook, we would have debated scenarios for the future, and we would have identified the top challenges the UK wants to go after. We posit a modern version of Eisenhower's Project Solarium to bring in big ideas, expose conflicting perspectives, and deliver coherent strategies for the future. Then Section 4 posits that because there will be genuine trade-offs between these pathways, these must be exposed to the public, and we should have an open conversation about them before deciding on our national strategy. So the national strategy will have produced at this stage. It's not a long document, it's not a 15-year plan, it's a short framework. It's an account of the top challenges facing us, the objectives we want to pursue in respect of them, and the big bets and core assumptions we're making about how we'll do it. In very simple terms, we'll have agreed the why, the what, and the how. Then Section 5 is about how we mobilise action. It sets out how long-term national strategy will act as a guiding framework for, and perhaps allow for, the reform of other planning cycles, such as the spending review and a new spatial strategy. It also looks at how we can get complex systems to pivot and adapt quickly, including through pioneer projects and adaptive learning techniques like simulations. So this section is about how we make these big pivots. Section 6 then involves evaluation and getting ready for a refresh of this process, which we posit should happen about once every 5 years. So there are many things to debate in this playbook, and we've all debated them at length. There are loads of design choices we've made where I think we could have chosen differently. But there are 4 reforms we consider completely critical, and those are the 4 I mentioned at the beginning. So to recap, they're about long-term horizons that go beyond electoral cycles, thinking about national, not government strategy, the ability to make and reimagine big bets, and openness and transparency. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, including what we've learned from other countries about how to design for them. So the first big thing is about the horizons that go beyond electoral cycles. Our proposal, just to recap in the playbook, is that we should adopt a 15-year horizon in the UK. It would involve us producing national scenarios to enable public debate about the future, and we'd update these broadly every 5 years. And that idea that we need a longer-term horizon, to be honest, is supported among every section of the stakeholders that we spoke to. So the lack of one is a common frustration among officials who feel that the system pushes short-term announcements over long-term goals. The liaison committee in Parliament has spoken of the need to break the cycle of siloed short-term thinking. And importantly, our study of places around the UK has also provided compelling evidence. And I want to acknowledge our fantastic partners in this, policy-wise, and the Future Governance Forum, and all those who contributed to our case studies and analysis. In Port Talbot, for example, people we interviewed told us that while they were used to government intervening positively during a crisis, there was a complete absence of a proactive conversation about future challenges and what they might want to do about them. And to quote an interviewee, "There is an absence of long-term strategy thinking that brings together all actors in a place around a common diagnosis of the challenges, a collective vision for the area's long-term future, and the bold decisions required to achieve it." People at a local level didn't buy that they should be limited by 5-year Westminster terms because they're already subject to multiple electoral cycles, whether that's Westminster, devolved or local. And actually, organisations in every governance layer, whether that's local, devolved or central government, see themselves as constrained from thinking long term. And each sees the layer above as a major source of uncertainty and one of the biggest constraints they have to their long-term thinking. So firstly, if you're a voluntary organisation delivering on the front line, you're in the worst possible position. And also, it's not the unpredictability of the challenges getting in the way of that kind of long-term thinking for these organisations. What they're saying is that it's the organisation above in the hierarchy. So there are strong and compelling reasons to introduce longer-term horizons at a UK level and in a systematic way, to foster a more stable environment and to enable other actors to take a longer-term, more ambitious approach too. Other countries already have routine practices for taking a longer outlook in a way that informs actors across their systems. The first country we studied was Spain, and we were immediately excited to see a country like ours in size and democratic makeup, one that had actually done a national strategy. We were really excited by that, something with real scope and ambition. And the España 2050 exercise enabled a long-term outlook based on 2 national scenarios. And what's striking is Spain's decision to root their long-term outlook in a direct comparison with other countries. They took this very outward-looking comparative approach. It looked at how Spain might change its future from a projected middle to a high-performing country in Europe, and it led to a public conversation in every region of Spain. We also studied Singapore, which has a world-renowned approach to strategic foresight and planning. So Singapore uses nested time horizons, recognising the need for different timeframes to deal with different issues. It maintains 50-year, 10 to 15-year and shorter horizons, all interacting with one another. And Singapore also uses scenarios about the future to test assumptions and challenge policy thinking. These are stories and ways of thinking about the world that have actually lodged in the brains of policymakers and proved really powerful in guiding action. So, for example, one scenario called Hotel Singapore imagined a prosperous global city, but one in which citizens felt transient and disconnected, more like hotel guests than a society. And officials described to us how it provided a corrective to status quo thinking. They said to themselves, if I carry on with this policy, will we end up like Hotel Singapore? The Netherlands also has been producing future scenarios since the 1950s, looking sort of 10 to 20 years ahead. And scenarios are well understood in the Dutch system as a way of informing debate on long-term policy choices. We were really interested in the 2010 exercise to produce the 2040 scenarios in the Netherlands, because we'd be able to see what the impact had been. And when we got excited and started Googling these, we actually found a myriad of 2040 strategies across the Dutch system. So banks had them, cities had them, there were sectoral strategies, government departments had them. And it shows how these scenarios have provided an anchor for cities, government, political parties, industries and businesses to plan around. They've helped frame and inform the debate in the Netherlands. They don't dictate what the future should be like. I should say we have also heard arguments defending short-termism, but they're not really arguments that you should only look at the things in front of your nose. They come more from the perspective that renewal should come from elections and that long-term strategy is essentially a technocratic exercise. And we should be using the strengths of our democracy, but a common time horizon would enable public transparency on how democratic actors and governments see the future, and it would provide an environment in which many actors beyond government could develop their views of the future horizon and set their own ambition accordingly. So to go on to the second big thing, which is why national and not government strategy. If you read this playbook after the lecture, you'll see there are many things for government to do in it. So we haven't shied away from the fact that this would need to be convened and led by government acting for the state as a whole. But we think it needs a really different mindset, one that's more open and more national in approach. We need new ways of thinking about the relationship with politics, with our national capacities, and with the public. So a critical question, of course, is how to stick to the path over longer time periods. How can we foster the consistent pursuit of these goals in a world of political competition? Long-term strategy has to make room for changes in political leadership, and longer time spans mean many actors and institutions will find themselves occupying different positions in the system at different points in the life of the strategy. For example, opposition MPs who become ministers and vice versa. So it's probably not realistic to secure public consensus between parties in our political system. Our system relies on space for disagreement and debate. But it is possible to design national strategy making in a way that builds our capability and our likelihood of achieving long-term goals across democratic institutions as well. So firstly, by fostering a consistent method, we think you build the capability for the system as a whole to look ahead cycle after cycle. As part of this, Parliament could also play a new role as guardian of the long term. And then secondly, by sharing diagnosis of challenges and core assumptions. Politicians might not agree on all of these, but a greater involvement would avoid unintended discontinuities between one government and the next. It would allow newly elected governments to get on more quickly with their agendas, because they wouldn't need to spend time getting to grips with a civil service analysis that had been obscure to them in opposition. That thinking should be opened up to others too. So one of the fundamental ideas that we drew from our international learning from countries like South Korea, Ireland and Japan is that the most effective strategic action comes when you can mobilise many of your national actors, your private sector, local government and civil society behind a national direction. In the countries I've mentioned, one of the things that left a real impression on us was the way that the people we spoke to whether from government, academia, industry, or local government, could speak fluently and consistently about the country's strategic advantages and disadvantages, its strengths and weaknesses, the problems they needed to solve, and the means by which the country might be successful in the future. They didn't just talk about this in sort of government policy language, but they could talk about how their country worked. For example, they might talk about the structure of the private sector, the balance of startups, scale-ups, and national champions that they needed, or the matching of future human capital to needs in the economy. And we were really inspired by this to develop a framework for how a country works as part of this project. In it, we've defined 5 national capacities: people, means, resources, capital, and institutions. And the idea is to understand the country not through policy domains or government levers, but in the actual components that add together to mean we can do things and achieve things. This is a piece of work we really hope to evolve to make it of direct use to policymakers in thinking beyond specific domains. In South Korea in particular, this fluency I spoke about didn't appear to us to be about active consensus. People pointed to a lot of vigorous debate and disagreement. But somehow this shared understanding of how the country is going to be successful allows very different types of organisation to row in the same direction. This was described to us in South Korea as a flotilla. So no one single person is steering the boats, but somehow they're all going somewhere together. We think this idea of a flotilla provides a model for how the UK could think about the output and impact of a national strategy process. It would mean a strong understanding between government and other partners in society about diagnosis and direction. We've shown we can do this in times of crisis, for example, during the pandemic and at different points in our history. And now we need to do this more structurally and around proactive goals. If we're going to make strategy about the future, the public must be engaged too, and not just on the easy part, on vision and preferences. We think we need to be braver about surfacing the hard trade-offs and the choices involved. We actually have a fantastic capability in the UK to understand public opinion and lived experience. For example, through polling companies, from organisations expert in citizen engagement, and from our regular surveys, censuses, and longitudinal studies. And these should be seen as a vital strategic capability. But we haven't updated our view of the public's role in setting policy direction for decades. Our approach to consultation would be recognisable to officials from the 1970s. We put out a big document, we ask for views. And yet the public, the locus of their discussions, where they're having them, how they consume news, where and to whom they offer opinions, the many groups who don't really appear in mainstream debate, including to a large degree young people, the public has radically changed. So now there's a range of different techniques we could employ for a national conversation: deliberative methods to rank options, more representative approaches like citizens' panels, or methods like the Delphi technique for a more polarised public to look at trade-offs and iterate their way to a consensus. The advent of tech-supported platforms and models to do this with greater reach and without huge expense has been trialled in many countries, with some well-known examples like Taiwan's experience of digital democracy. Lots of cities around the world are also innovating in how they involve citizens in choices about the future. So we ought to be learning about this at a national level and developing our tools and techniques for citizen engagement as a new state capability. To move on to the third big thing, which is about big bets and proper choices, a core concern we've had is how could we reimagine our big bets as a country? How do we make sufficiently bold choices about the future? And we've looked again to other countries who we think do this better. For example, Japan's big intervention on semiconductors or its approach to green transformation demonstrate a greater comfort perhaps in making big choices and a greater confidence that they'll be able to mobilise all sorts of different actors from regional government to the private sector to secure their success. In the UK, there's perhaps a sense sometimes that we have too much strategy. Some people spoke to us of a blizzard of government strategies with many actions and commitments, but which confuse overall strategic intent. So how could we cut through and align on a few big coherent approaches? Set up in 1953, President Eisenhower's Project Solarium was a uniquely explicit attempt to force hard choices and coherent options. His team identified three competing approaches to the Cold War. One was to forego direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. One was to push back militarily and raise the imminent threat of nuclear war. And one was to draw a line in the sand around defined spheres of influence. He tasked three different groups to develop each into a compelling plan, and the work culminated in a presidentially chaired debate in the White House and a major strategic pivot. And we've been particularly interested in the Solarium exercise because of what it was able to do. It opened up the space for bigger thinking about ideas and approaches. Eisenhower desperately wanted a broader range of options, not just the ones being presented to him. It forced the conflict between different perspectives out into the open. In Eisenhower's case, people from diplomatic, military and economic domains were disagreeing in separate briefings, but they weren't confronting these disagreements and what those disagreements really meant about the choices on offer. It meant that different pathways were worked up with a real sense of commitment. So because they were working in teams, the task forces worked hard to make the best case for their option. They considered benefits and risks, and they provided comprehensive strategies to make their approach successful. And then lastly, it went deep. The three task forces were commissioned to produce not just overarching strategies, but detailed plans. They got down to the level of maps and resources and how they were going to be allocated. And so that meant that they were looking at some of the trade-offs in fine detail. I think our political leaders today are expressing a similar frustration, perhaps, to Eisenhower, that the status quo somehow isn't good enough, but that alternative pathways aren't clear. We think the Solarium model provides a solution. It isn't easy to do. It requires confidence, resources and commitment. And it doesn't take away the need for politicians to make difficult choices, but it does enable them to do this with a real sense of what the alternatives are. Eisenhower's Solarium was a secretive exercise that took place mainly in the national security community. We think there are benefits in employing this method openly and across domains, social and economic, as well as foreign policy and national security. Our contemporary Project Solarium in the playbook involves options and pathways being developed in the open with a wider set of partners. We think it has the potential to open up our thinking, expose genuine choices, and build a far broader coalition that is then ready to deliver. Our fourth big thing is that long-term strategy making should be open and transparent. There's a point in publishing the method today so that everybody's able to see how they would engage in the national debate. And at each stage in the playbook, there's a published output so that many partners and the public can follow the development of national strategy and have a chance to influence it. What I've described over the course of this lecture isn't the task of a few people in a stuffy room. It's a practice. It's a practice we have to get good at, using certain tools and approaches and building common frameworks among many participants. We need somewhere to build our capacity for this practice, to build the relationships and common language, and to train people in the tools and mindsets that can bear the weight of the challenges ahead. At the moment, politicians, civil servants, business leaders, local government and public service leaders train and learn in largely different spaces. We need to train in a more open and collective way and make our deep assumptions and differences more transparent to each other. So to build capacity for the long term, it's really important that an organisation like a National School of Government should have the mandate to convene across sector, to create spaces for joint problem solving oriented to our biggest challenges. It should also be tasked to reimagine how we make our system learn quickly through simulations and exercises and through rapid reviews when something goes wrong. It's only by increasing this capability to learn quickly that we'll have the confidence to pivot when underlying realities change. This fellowship started from the position that we are going to have to think very differently about the next 20 years compared to the last. That the set of challenges we face, global volatility, climate change, demographics, high public debt, a straining social contract, and a deep societal fear that the next generation won't do as well as the last, are inextricably connected. That we're held back by short-termism and a somewhat ingrained assumption that change is best managed as part of a crisis. That some of the underlying bets that have conditioned government for 20 to 30 years are outdated and have to be replaced. And that we have intractable problems we've somehow accepted as too difficult to solve. What we need now is big thinking, imagination, and a way of engaging the public across generations, across the economy and society, and across geographies on some of the major phenomena that are going to revolutionise our world. This is not just our diagnosis. It's been drawn from the people we've spoken to across the course of this project, people from politics, government, local government, civil society, and the private sector. And there is evidence across the world from countries like us and unlike us that we can radically improve our capability to respond. We've spent this year redesigning how we do long-term national strategy in the UK. We've written the playbook. It's now over to you to decide what sort of future do you want. Thank you.
This is an ambience. Sticky.
Sorry, I wasn't standing here to get more applause. But just before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to do a few personal thanks. So I want to say a huge thank you to Suzanne Heywood, who has been a brilliant supporter via the Heywood Foundation, but also personally over the course of this project. To Tamara Finkelstein, who couldn't be here, but is the civil service sponsor of this project. To Dominic Wilson, who was my co-initiator of this set of thinking and has been a huge friend to the project. At Blavatnik, there are far too many people to mention, but I do want to say by name a big thanks to Sandy Steele and Hannah Oland for being brilliant project support to us, and to Sam Lee, who was our MPP associate during the summer and was a brilliant contributor to the project. And then finally, I want to say a huge, huge thanks to my team, to Marius Ostrovsky, Zainab Aga, Alex Downing and Philip Bray, and to Benjamin Clayton, who is watching online. I've had the privilege of presenting our work to you today, but the work would be nothing without these 5 brilliant people. So huge thanks and applause to them. Thank you.
Congratulations on an outstanding Heywood Fellow lecture. I will filibuster for a bit. Please get yourself some water. And I think you've earned it. Plenty of time. So my name is Kieran Martin. I'm one of the professors of practice here at the Blavatnik School. If you don't know what that is, you're not alone, including many others, including me, struggle with it. One of the privileges is I spend quite a lot of time in this chair, getting to ask people after outstanding contributions, getting to ask them some questions. So indeed, it was put to me earlier today that my job is a very highbrow chat show host. So with that in mind, I'll say just a little bit of how our Q&A stroke chat show will work. If you're in the room, please do ask a question. There are roving microphones. I will try to call people as best I can. We've some excellent questions online already. As Karthik has already said, if you do ask a question, you will be on camera. So it will help us if you do give your name and organisation. The advantage of that from you is otherwise Lucy and I can describe who you are to the watching world. If you're online, and I can see already various people are doing this, please do submit your questions in the normal way. let me abuse chair's privilege just first of all, and then I'll take an online question. That gives people plenty of time to put up hands. If you can already do that and try and catch mine or Lucy's eye, do so at any time. But quick question from me. You mentioned admiringly some other countries who in various ways at various times have done this, and Singapore often gets singled out, and its story, for anyone who knows it, it's almost obvious. It was existential, a poor bit of land, lots of ethnic tensions, it had to do it. But there are others, post-war the United States with Eisenhower, you mentioned Ireland and so forth. Have you thought of any common factors that create the conditions for this type of thinking that can take place?
So I mean, a bit as you say, you can sort of see clusters of countries who face into a particular crisis or existential threat, who have a much more obviously national strategic approach. So I think I described during the course of the lecture that the framework we're sort of aiming for is, can we identify the top 5 challenges, objectives and big bets? And if you could describe that, you'd have a pretty strong view of what your national strategy is. So we used that framework to try and analyse other countries and sort of say, how easy is it to look at other countries and see whether they've had a national strategy? And how easy is it to look at our own history and say, when we sort of had one? We weren't trying to say whether they had specifically decided they had one or not, but more like, could you divine it? And it is true that it's easier to divine those in countries facing some sort of existential challenge, but it's not exclusively the case. The countries we were trying to sort of study are those that we think have adopted these sorts of practices in order to sort of get some sort of control over the future and deliver proactive responses.
And very quickly, before we go to the audience questions, having looked at all these examples, your very first point, the time horizon beyond an electoral cycle, you've gone for 15 years.
Yes.
President Xi and his party colleagues sometimes go for 5, sometimes go for 10. The Spanish have gone for 2050, you've gone for 2040. Why?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say, given the China references, it's not a 15-year plan. We're not planning to write down in great detail every sort of action you take for 15 years and not deviate from it. Not that I'm suggesting that is exactly what China does either. The idea is, how do you take a longer-term horizon on the questions that you're trying to answer now? And we chose, like, you could choose different time horizons. If we get to run the National Strategy Playbook, but the one thing we have to concede on is 20 years instead of 15, I think we'd be very happy. But we had to decide. So we chose 15 years, and that was for 2 reasons. One is, we think it's quite a qualitative reason, but we think 15 years is quite a human amount of time. I think people with young children can think towards what the world might be like when they're leaving school. Or if you're 18, you probably can't imagine what it's like to be in your 40s, but you are embarking on a period of your life where you're going to go through perhaps higher education, get a job, start a family. Like, it's a kind of, it's a generational sort of period where asking people what they think the future should look like at the end of it makes human sense. And then the second, slightly more analytical reason is that we did a study on the UK's history. And one of the things that the UK's history shows is that we basically make some sort of a strategic update or pivot about once every 15 years. So you can imagine, if we were looking at 15-year chunks, we ought to be thinking about that, not just projecting continuity. And Marius has written a fantastic paper on the UK's national strategy in historical perspective, which goes into that in a lot more detail.
Well, we'll look out for that. Thank you. Now, there is a question, 3rd row from the back, and so if we could just get the microphone there. But before that question gets asked, let's go to one online, because you mentioned 15-year horizons, and it's just under 15 years ago, I think, when Sir Bernard Jenkin and the Parliamentary Committee did a very significant report that got a lot of attention on who does strategy in the UK. And it is a question from Sir Bernard. At least we haven't done the identity verification, but I do hope it is in. And very pleased, a huge step forward. Pleased there'll be a National Strategy Secretariat. But it is in the nature of strategy as a continuing process. You have to keep changing your plans to match changing circumstances and learn from experience. So the 5-year framework can be no more than what we might call a strategic concept. It cannot be a fixed plan. Do you agree?
Yes, so I mean, I think that means if the realities of your world adjust so much that your 15-year outlook no longer makes sense, of course you should update it. We've sort of suggested this as a routine, a practice that you introduce into your system so that you're doing this combined forward look on a regular basis, and that would be a big update to what we have now. I don't think we mean to imply that you wouldn't also be adaptive and flexible when realities change within the framework that you've set. So I agree with Bernard's point.
Great, thank you. First question from the floor. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a great lecture. I'm looking at the diagram that posits a national office for foresight and strategy, and it wouldn't be the first of its kind. So I think looking back at the beginning of the Blair period, there were things like the policy or the forward policy unit, and then the strategy unit, horizons, and those did some elements of what you're describing. What are the lessons of looking back at those? Because they don't exist now. So what would be different for your 15-year horizon that would say, if set up in the next couple of years, something would have longevity in a way that its forerunners haven't?
Yeah, please.
So I think that the way that we have tried to think differently is that we didn't really start with institutions. We didn't start with the National Office of Foresight and Strategy. We've sort of posited it because somebody has to run this practice that we're advocating for. What we wanted to do is think about method, like what is this practice of national strategy making, of long-term thinking? How do we introduce it as a habit into the state, which gets repeated and learned and means that we evolve a better way of thinking about the future? So, I mean, institutions come and go, but could we sort of solidify this learned practice within the way we do this in the UK state? And you're right. I mean, there are all sorts of examples of how some of this has been done before, but then we're trying to sort of reinstate some of that best practice through this process.
So there's a question just right in the back row, underneath the clock where it says 18. But whilst we're getting the microphone over there, I'll try to brigade 3 online questions, which are essentially about institutions. And it's about, if you like, the relative importance of institutional design and capability in this whole approach. So one question from Martin Lobos is about how this would apply to parts of the world where perhaps institutional strength has been weaker than it has been in the UK and some of the countries you mentioned. Yulia is talking about what institutional features are needed to make sure that scientific foresight is translated into implementable and durable policy. So have you any reflections, I suppose, on the relative importance of getting the institutional design right here and what the optimal institutional framework really is?
Yeah, I mean, I will be quite careful to suggest that I'm able to advise other countries about how to do this. This has been quite a UK-focused playbook, if you like. But I hope it provides a sort of provocation and way of thinking if you were looking to any other system to just sort of compare and contrast to some of the things that we're advocating for. I mean, in the UK, we're very lucky about the way that we've brought science into government. And actually, the Government Office for Science is updating its big approach to trends at some point next year. So some of these capabilities that we need in the playbook, they certainly already exist, and we've tried to design somewhat around them. I mean, I think if you work through the playbook, you would see the specific capabilities we think need to exist institutionally. But I think something about the common method of the framework of the playbook means we're not suggesting you need a specific institutional makeup. You could be designed in many different ways, and as long as there is someone to coordinate the process, as long as you have analysts who can do trends work, as long as you have a capacity to do futures and foresight, it doesn't matter how you've set it up. It should be possible to construct a playbook like this from whatever your institutional structures are.
Excellent answer, and I think that will help, even though you were understandably reticent about expanding your prescription into other countries. Yes, sir, right at the back.
Hi, my name is Senkai. I'm an MPhil student in international relations here at Oxford. Thank you so much for your talk and evidently the huge amount of thought that's gone into this. I'm curious about, in terms of the institutional design and the delivery architecture, how much consideration was there given to sort of the level of political capital that would need to be invested by elected officials in terms of conceiving and executing a national strategy? And if that then would create a risk for, say, if there was a new administration, for that sort of be partisanly discarded, if there was that change?
So we obviously have thought about that a lot. And I think I was sort of describing this a little bit in the lecture, in that what we're advocating for here is quite a big sort of reform of the way things are done, and one that we'd have to learn and get more habituated to. So and there are different levels at which cross-party it could be agreed to politically. So at the sort of first stage is everybody at least agrees to the practice and the process. They don't have to agree to any of the content, but we could agree that this is quite a good thing to do on a regular basis, and that whoever happens to be in charge will get to run it, and it will be a method understood by everybody. One step up from that would be perhaps there might be some sort of agreement on at least part of the diagnosis. So you would see between changes of governments sort of taking over some part of the diagnosis that they still agreed with, and therefore a greater degree of sort of continuity in our understanding of the world. A level that we haven't sort of tried to suggest will definitely happen is sort of major continuity of those kind of big bets and goals, because one would assume that prime ministers who come in a change of government would want to sort of rethink that and make their own statement about it. But I did mention as well in the lecture about sort of unintended discontinuity. I think that can happen in our system quite a lot as well, in that, you know, sometimes political parties are happy to inherit the strategies that already exist. They want to make rapid progress. It's just they might not understand quite how 5 different assumptions knit together, so one gets unknitted and then things sort of change which in an undesired way. So I think this openness is really important to that continuity of purpose.
You're provoking a lot of questions.
No.
We have 2 here, the one in red, and then the colleague beside her. If you and I'll try and get to as many others as possible. So if we can, yeah, both of you I think have. Oh, well, Ben, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm Juliet Prodden from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So my question is related to the gentleman's over there as well. Perhaps as more a comment than a question. But Lucy, you're talking about sort of the need for the long-term time horizon. I strongly endorse that, and that came out in the work we did with you as well. It can't be denied that politics at the moment is a short-term game, and it's about the other as much as it is about what you have to offer. It's about as much the fault of the people before you and what you are doing to counter that, as it is about setting out a new vision for the long term. So my question is really related to incentives. How do you create the incentives that you need for the longer term strategy? Have you put thought into that? And for that reason, I really like your idea of the national conversation and creating that sense of national identity, common purpose that is not only held by the government, but that is held by a wider constituency of stakeholders across the country, which will then perhaps create that longer term incentive. Anyway, so my question is really around incentives and how do we get from where we are now to using the brilliant ideas that you've set out here? Thank you.
I mean, I've got a short and quite a long answer to
How about medium?
medium. I mean, I suppose
Serve with the middle option is always the right
the
one.
middle option. I mean, to the sort of question. I mean, I think there is a lot in this playbook for politicians, and I don't think we're trying to get rid of normal politics by doing this. I think that will always exist, and we're not trying to sort of say that politics should be completely different. We're saying there should be a new ingredient, which is this. And I think there's a lot in there for politicians. I think I mentioned the frustration that I think lots of politicians express at coming into government and being confronted with this machine who present sets of options that seem very sort of status quo-ish or incremental, and they don't really know how to sort of get the civil service, I suppose, to kind of open up, join up across lots of different domains and genuinely sort of explore these broader dimensions and new big bets. One of the things that has been, I think, quite successful in our conversations with government over the course of this project is this idea of big bets as being sort of something you need to do to sort of introspectively examine what assumptions you're holding that you probably don't examine very often, but sometimes need to update. And how do we do that sort of individually and collectively has been one of the things we've been trying to think about. So we can sort of hold the status quo more than politicians want to. And so I think there's quite a big benefit in this for trying to sort of make that happen more swiftly and be able to deliver more swiftly as well.
Very nice answer, very difficult question. I've been discriminating against people at the front. I will come right to you next, but I'm right in the front row, and then I'm going to go right to the back. I was just wait for the microphone just for online
Thank you
people.
so much for putting this on the table. Brilliant. I'll just say, in about 2001, I worked on the UK Spatial Development Framework for the RTPI, Royal Town Planning Institute. And we went all around the houses of government, housing, transport, farming, and so on. And they were also, yes, National Spatial Framework, jolly good idea, you know. So we had a whole set of diagrams, a bit like yours, actually. And then I went to see the head of planning in the Department of Environment, as it was. And he said, well, technically, it's a no-brainer. Of course, you've got to have a strategy. Politically, it's a non-starter. Because. Now, scrolling forward, 25 years. So next week, I'm going to be in Beijing giving a lecture with the Chinese Academy of Science on pretty much the same topic, i.e. foresight, or the application of foresight in the real world, so to say, which is where we get the report off the shelf, where it often ends up, Government Office of Science, into the political domain. Now, the Chinese say, oh, yeah, well, we've been doing this for years, we can show you how to do it, actually. 5-year plan, 20-year plan, and so on. So the question really to you now is to say, does this really depend on a much stronger version of government than we have right now, where, as we see, they're sort of swinging wildly between extremes? Every issue they touch seems to be horrendously divisive and conflicted.
All right, so the strengths of the executive branch.
Yeah. I mean, I think my answer to that is we haven't offered this practice to government. So we can do that now, and then we have a method and a practice that we could introduce in order to get the benefits that I've talked about, the longer term horizon, the access to more broader ideas and a sort of bigger sense of the trade-offs between them. So, this is the first time we've had this.
Yeah.
So I guess time will tell us the answer to the question.
Gentleman at the back row has been waiting patiently, and I think I've got 3 hands left over here, and we've just about have time to fit those in if everyone is succinct.
Hi, my name's Theo Silverstone. Can I just say thank you for this? I think this work is so exciting. And as someone who's interested in foresight futures, I just find it really encouraging. I had a question around the national conversation. I think it's important to put the science in the room in relation to the way in which we imagine and the fact that that comes from our memories. And if we don't have, innovative new notions of how the world could be, that constrains our ability to imagine different things. And so I kind of wanted to query how you're thinking about that, specifically engaging with the public, because I think at the moment, certainly it feels quite bleak. And if that's the only thing that we're taking in, maybe we don't get what I hope is slightly more radical visions of the future.
So great question. I think we know from your lecture, you're not planning a national consultation document, but how would you plan to have the national conversation? What matters?
I mean, there are 2 points in the playbook where we're talking to the public in particular. One is about these future national scenarios, and look, there are many ways you could design these scenarios, but the way we were thinking about it was, you wouldn't put up a sort of straw man terrible future versus a straw man brilliant future and say, what do you think? What they do in the Netherlands is they put out 3 just quite different types of future. So, here's a future focused on the pursuit of economic growth. Here's a future predicated on something more focused on sort of fairness and well-being. Here's a third future more based on, I can't quite remember, environment. There you go. So they put out sort of different futures, but driven by different drivers, so that you can sort of seed a conversation. You're not going to be able to choose which one to have, but you can start opening that conversation about what these different futures could look like. And then there's a second part in which we engage the public in our playbook. This is the point at which we've gone through all of the work to identify our challenges. We've looked at different actual realistic pathways, and we're showing the public what the trade-offs are between them. So there's a different kind of engagement then to get a bit more sort of quantitative evidence about what the public might want.
Brilliant, thank you. One question here, and then we'll go over there. Please.
Hi, good evening. My name's Eleanor Williams. I'm a UK civil servant. In defence, we make big bets. We've increased to 2.5% GDP spending. Arguably also AUKUS was a big bet. Does your approach help us break new ground on middle power national strategy?
Really interesting reference to AUKUS because it's challenging national strategy and delivering 3 countries. But any reflections?
Yeah, I think the person who's going to break new ground on this question is Jenny in the next Heywood Fellowship. But yes, I mean, I think the idea is that we have a basis from which to say our big bet about our role in the world has to change. And how do we then cascade those new assumptions through all of the ways that we do our business so that we can be successful in this new role? It doesn't help if different parts of the system persist with completely different assumptions from one another.
And very nicely done, giving your successor a task already. Gentlemen, thank you.
Hi, I'm Toby, a DPhil student at the Pandemic Sciences Institute. There's been a lot of academic work going back for centuries on strategic theory in the military sphere, and particularly on the contentious definition of this word strategy, as well as the constant activity of practitioners contributing to national strategy in politics and the civil service and so on. You mentioned inspirations from other countries, but could you give us some examples of individual thinkers, whether they're academics or politicians or officials, who've been particularly influential on your thinking about strategy?
I don't know if I've got a series of people to sort of name. We didn't try to write down a pithy definition of what strategy is. We have said very clearly to ourselves that long-term national strategy making is a practice, and we need to design the practice. So it's these sets of activities and behaviours and relationships and structures and institutions that lead you as a state to be successful over the long term. So that's sort of how we've defined it for this project, rather than sort of looking at specific thinkers or philosophers and saying they've nailed it and we've gone with their idea.
Excellent. We're coming towards the end of our time. I don't know if there's anybody who was itching to ask a question or haven't called yet. If not, then I want to turn and abuse chair's privilege one last time and turn to the fellowship and the person whose name it bears. So perhaps a little one for the insiders and former insiders amongst us, but if you were to take this, let's say you're on your way to a meeting with the great Sir Jeremy Heywood as Cabinet Secretary, somebody who, as Suzanne said, was hugely interested in innovative thinking, but a real pragmatist who got stuff done. And to use the title of Suzanne's excellent book, What Would Jeremy Think? So you're walking in there into this quietly intimidating atmosphere. And I can't do the Jeremy Heywood unimpressed stare, so I'm not going to. But what would you, and you might want to answer this in reverse order so you can finish on an optimistic note. You're walking in there, what would you be most worried about as you say to Jeremy, look, here's the National Strategy Playbook you commissioned. And what would you be most optimistic about in terms of thinking, he's going to love this? Or would Jeremy think bad and good?
I'm struggling to feel worried. It might be too, I might be not channeling enough. But I think the first thing that I would be disappointed if Jeremy didn't do is he would take the whole thing apart.
Yeah.
Like limb from limb. And so,
Picking up the pieces.
and I think it's worth saying that this is our first go, right? The thing that would have to happen to this playbook is lots of people contest it. Lots of people tell us about all the design choices we've got wrong. Lots of people tell us how we should change various aspects of the method. And we take it apart and put it back together again. And then you'd have iteration 2, then maybe you'd get iteration 3. Like this should be a thing that is iterated. This is the sort of alpha product. We should have a beta product. And, that's how we should think about this particular playbook. But then the second thing I think Jeremy would do, which is also an optimistic thing, is I think he would say, who can we get to do the things in here? Like who's already basically doing parts of this playbook who we can now bring together into a room, and then I can point at them and say, right, now this is your job. And he'd be great at convening that. So I think I'd go into it with great confidence, A, that I'd get months of challenge, but B, after that, we'd actually be doing this or some other version of it.
And a lot of people with a lot of work to do at very specific times. So, Lucy, that was a great answer. I can't speak for Suzanne, but I suspect Jeremy will be very pleased with this piece of work, and it's a credit to the foundation, and best wishes to Jenny. So all it leaves me to do on behalf of the school and the Dean, and with thanks to Hartford, whose principal is here, Pat Roach, and the ASRC and your team and everybody for coming, is to thank you for a wonderful lecture and indeed report and product. Thank you very much, Lucy Smith.
Thank you, Verena. Everyone.